This is Cold Start.
There's been a lot of really interesting stuff going on here at Sonoma lately. You know, we had Velocity Invitational, we had the NASCAR races, we had NHRA, we had Ferrari Challenge, all this stuff going on right here in our hometown. But there's more going on elsewhere in California, too.
I feel like California in general is just such a hot spot for motorsports. For us, we normally talk about road course racing because that's what we love, that's what we do. And we have such phenomenal tracks like Sonoma, like Laguna Seca, and the like. But Northern California and the valley of kind of Central California is really well known for its circle track stuff. And there's a lot of really cool hidden gems of racetracks and motorsport activity going on and in places that you wouldn't normally visit to begin with.
You know, there's those parts of California, too, that we kind of forget about. Most of us live in the more metropolitan areas, all the way out in Shasta or in the middle of the state somewhere. There's these destinations that we just don't know about, but they've been there. They support a community. There's exciting stuff going on in them, and it's such a big state sometimes it's hard to be aware of everything going on around us, you know. So getting out on the road and exploring a little bit is a really fun thing to do, and given all the motorsports and cars and motorcycles and all these things that have had history here, it makes like a perfect ground zero for it.
Yeah, so that reminds me, the other week I was on a road trip. Essentially, I guess it was a business trip. I was doing some of those security driving programs that I do, and so we were out in kind of areas of California that I wouldn't normally visit on my own. So one of those areas was Crow's Landing, which is a abandoned NASA airstrip.
Oh, cool.
Which is a really, really cool place to train just because you have so much sheer space. But it's kind of like south of Tracy. People that are not from California are not going to know what I'm talking about, but it's this northern central valley where there's a lot of agriculture going on. There's a lot of groves of almond trees and other vegetation being grown. But then during this trip that I was on, we did a handful of programs at Crow's Landing, but then we were also going to do a program at Willow Springs down near LA, the racetrack down there, Willow Springs.
Oh, sure.
And so on this trip, on this business trip, I was with our good friend Nick Strickler.
Oh, Uncle Strick.
The Euro NASCAR driver who we had on the podcast a while ago, a handful of episodes ago. But he's been joining me on these security driving programs as a fellow instructor. And so we had this travel day to go from effectively Crow's Landing down to Willow Springs, and we drove down kind of the Central Valley of California. And we were going to drive through Fresno and Bakersfield, all these cities of California that people are like, ugh, why would you ever go there? And like, truthfully, yes, I understand, like, people don't go to these areas just to travel to them for no reason, but we had to drive down to get to our next destination. And on this road trip, you know, we were like, is there anything out here that's worth stopping for? Because we normally wouldn't be out here. And since we are here, is there like a cool aviation museum? Is there a cool activity? Is there some oval track that is putting on some event? It was a Wednesday that we were doing this, so like highly unlikely, but like, hey, if there's something going on, let's stop and let's check it out.
Yeah, there's a lot of these back roads and places you wouldn't normally find yourself going on purpose unless you had to be there or you were nearby. And out in the middle of the state, there's these roads that you drive by on the freeway at high speed. You never even think twice about, but you ever get off on one of those? There's some interesting stuff out there, you know, and coming from, I guess, Crow's Landing's northern central part of the state to get down to Fresno, you probably took like Highway 99 to get down there.
I think that's what it was. It was some Highway 90-something.
Yeah, well, you passed Madera there, which I remember Uncle Strick was talking about going there and doing some dirt racing at the Madera track.
Yes, we passed Madera Speedway, and it was funny because we were driving two different cars, so we were texting and calling one another of like, hey, like, we're coming up on this area, this, that, the other, and Strick was like, as we passed Madera, it's like, I hate that place. Never raced good there. Like, we don't need to stop. We don't need to check that place out. And I was like, all right, cool. Like, we'll keep it rolling. And so I'm on just searching on Google Maps, Apple Maps. I'm like, museums. Like, I don't know. Is there like an attraction or something that we can stop at? And I'm looking through all the like local museums and zoos and stuff like that. And all of a sudden I come across a flat track museum, which flat track motorcycle racing is its own form. It's basically circle track, dirt track motorcycle racing. And I'm like, I know nothing about flat track racing. I've had friends that have done it. Like, I've seen it on TV every once in a while, and I know that it's cool, and I know that it's rad. And I look at a couple of the photos from the museum online, and I'm like, this is sick. We need to stop.
And what is it about flat track that differentiates it from the other kind of racing? Like, I'd imagine these are dirt tracks or are these paved tracks?
Dirt tracks primarily, so like, and not a lot of banking. So like
Okay,
the way that
yeah.
with flat track, like it doesn't have really high banked corners. At least this is what I think about. Like, and I'm sure that there's like divisions of different types of flat track that I just have no idea about. But like for me, thinking about flat track bikes, I'm usually thinking about, dirt ovals, motorcycles, and they're the ones where they got the thing drifted out. Like they got the thing laid down and like the rear tire's sliding and the front tire is guiding where the bike's going. And like they almost have like one leg touching the dirt trying to slide these things around.
Yeah, I've seen this and I wasn't sure what the differential was. I guess most of the oval tracks have some banking to them. So the difference here is that these are just flat all the way. There's no banking. So the surface itself isn't giving any grip, right? It's just slippery because
Yes.
you're at the adhesion of the tire as your limit and that's all you got.
And then like there's different categories within the flat track style for like the different bikes that you would use for it, which once again, I don't know, right? Like I'm totally like new to this realm of motorsport. But as soon as I see that there's this museum, I send it to Strick. I'm like, dude, we got to go. He saw one photo of it. He's like, this place looks rad. We got to go. So it's called the Clovis Flat Track Museum, which it's basically like the north end of Fresno. So we take this detour to go to this museum. And when we first roll up, the only photos that we saw were from the inside. So we're like, oh, this place looks huge. Like it looks massive. So we're thinking like it's this own standalone building.
Right, yeah.
When we roll up to the address, we're in a neighborhood. And where it's like, this is just someone's house. Like it says like, oh, you've arrived to your destination. You look over and you're like, it looks like a house and a garage attached to it and like this big dirt lawn that like almost looked like a parking lot. But I'm like, I don't think we need to park there. So we street parked. And we get out and we look at the sign, and it says Clovis Flat Track Museum. We're like, all right, we're in the right location. And Nick reads, he's like, oh, it's by appointment only. And I'm like, damn it. Like, because you look at this place and you're like, yeah, it doesn't just look like it's open to the public 5 days a week, 9 to 5. And so we try to call the number, and no one picks up. We try to call the other number, still no answer. And we're like, all right, we need to use the bathroom. Let's go to like the Chick-fil-A down the street and do that and like recuperate what we're going to do next. And when we get done with Chick-fil-A, we get a call back and they're like, oh yeah, we're here. Like, come on in. Like, doors open, just walk in. And we're like, sick. All right, we'll be there at 11. And so we drive back to the museum and we walk in the door. And the first room you walk into at this museum it just looks like a workshop. Once again, like the building itself just looks like someone's garage, workshop area, their own personal use. You open the door and it looks exactly like that. And you're like, damn, this room's kind of small. There's like maybe 3 bikes in it. It looks like the area that they do like a lot of restorations or they're working on these bikes. And then there's a bunch of cases with like memorabilia and toys and stuff like that. And the walls are covered in posters. It's a cool room.
Yeah.
But we're like, is this it? Is this the whole museum? Like, kind of seems like a gyp on that end.
You're like, how much history is there to this flat track stuff anyway? How long did that go for?
Yeah, which, and so we're like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like, kind of expected more. And the guy that was there was like kind of one of the people that look over the collection, helps work on the bikes, stuff like that. And he was like, oh no, there's more. Like there's way more. And he goes to the back end of this room and he opens up the door and it opens up to an additional room behind that's just filled with bikes.
Oh, it's like the actual showroom.
Yes, like the actual museum. And it's like multi-layered and like there had to have been hundreds of bikes a part of this collection. And I'm just like in awe. And I'm like, this place is so cool. And then you get to the back end of that room, he opens up another door and there's a third room filled with bikes. So the front room was just like the workshop. As the collection grew, they built this addition to the back end of it. The first room filled that up with bikes. And then they had to build the third part, the second room add-on that then was also filled with bikes. So like this place, even though it was narrow, it was deep.
That's
and like
crazy.
they had a bunch of bikes in there.
It's like the lost motorcycle vaults you found in the middle of Fresno.
Right, which I'm like, flat track racing, I can't imagine that there's like, there are fans, I don't want to get it wrong, but like, to me, it doesn't seem like a super, super popular form of motorsports or motorcycle racing. Like, usually when people talk about that stuff, it's supermoto or, like motocross, like that sort of end. Like, flat track is, I think, its own unique thing in and of itself. And, I'm like, yeah, how many people actually care to like keep the history and this sort of deal alive? And evidently there was an individual, and the story of how this museum came about is actually a really, really interesting one. And the individual that put it together, he was a racer back in the day. He raced flat track there locally in that area. And I guess in the Valley of California, like flat track racing is a really popular thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
There's not that much to do in the Valley of California. So like you find things to get involved in. But the individual that started this museum, he ended up having an accident hiking and ended up getting paralyzed. And so he couldn't race anymore. He ended up in a wheelchair. But instead of that kind of sinking him and him going away from the community, it really sparked him to be like, I still want to be really active in the flat track community, and then became a steward to start collecting these bikes and collecting the history of flat track racing through the years. And he went to different auctions to collect bikes and gather things and posters and video and all these little bits and pieces, collectibles, toys, like everything that had to do with flat track racing, motorcycle racing, all that stuff. And that's how the collection grew and grew and grew. And unfortunately, since he has passed away, and so like there's only these stewards left of the collection to keep it going.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so rad to see something like this that is alive and well. And like for me, walking through with Nick, and both of us have no idea, like no knowledge about any of these bikes, but we're like, this is just cool that this exists. And there's these people that are so passionate about this thing to keep it alive and wanting to share the history with other people. And the guy that was there, that was kind of the handler of the collection, he walked us personally through everything and was telling the stories of like, oh, this bike, and oh, this one's from Japan, and there's only 3 of these in the US, and this one's cool because of this, this, and this. And it was just so rad to see that. And it was totally one of those moments of like, this is why I love motorsports.
Yeah.
This is why I love racing and this passion and community, is because there's these people and there's these things that are off the beaten path. And if you stumble upon them, it's like the wealth of knowledge and history that's there is just so cool to experience.
So many interesting stories, so many weird little corners to go down and things to learn about and find out. And there's passion for this thing that you have barely even heard of, right? And you talk to somebody who's knowledgeable about it, and it just kind of lights you up because there's this whole world, and you're getting the perspective through this person's eyes of what they see and what they've seen. And the museum always makes me think about sort of origins, like where did this stuff come from? What's been the evolution over time? So were there a lot of older bikes there? Were there things from kind of like the early days of when flat track was kind of in its heyday?
Yeah, there was a lot of vintage bikes, like a lot of like from the earlier years. Nothing of like, there wasn't a lot in regard to like early 1900s. I think there was only 1 or 2 bikes from like early days of basically motorcycle racing, period. And those things were really, really interesting. Definitely one of the highlights was there was this old, I think it was a 1912 Indian motorcycle or race bike, essentially. And it did look very much like a bicycle with an engine more than it did a motorcycle that we think about nowadays. But it was one of those bikes that raced on those board tracks that we talked about in an earlier episode when we were talking about circle track racing and in regards to sprint cars,
right,
and some of those origins and the board tracks, those race tracks that were made out of essentially 2x4s, pieces of wood. This was one of those bikes that had raced on board tracks back in the day. And another one of the interesting things that was there was it was a buggy. It was 4 wheels, but it effectively was built on a bicycle or a motorcycle chassis and had 4 motorcycle wheels and tires and an Indian-powered engine power plant in it. And it was like this little kind of 4-wheel, kind of like a midget racer. Like we think about like nowadays, the sprint cars, the midgets, the smaller ones. It was effectively one of those. And that was also a board track racer. And the story that we got on that one was it was used back in the day, like this 4-wheeled motorcycle engine powered was just to see who had the most powerful and the fastest engines. And so they kind of put them on these little buggies so they were more stable on the board tracks.
That's sick. And if you think about it, when you look at one of those old cars, these like buggies with the motorcycle engine, that's kind of like what a radical is. If you think about today, it's not a buggy in that way. It's a prototype the way we've developed them, but it's just this 4-wheeled thing wrapped around a motorcycle engine that we think of as a 2-wheel vehicle, right? So kind of things that are old come back around again, just like when the first cars were coming around, they were electric until they figured out that wasn't really ready for prime time, and now we're looking at that all over again.
Yeah, one of the last highlights that was in this collection was they had a Pikes Peak bike.
Oh, no way.
And of course, me having done Pikes Peak, I'm like, hey, that's cool.
Yeah.
I dig that. I know that race. I know what they do at Pikes Peak.
Uh-huh.
Where the flat track stuff, like, once again, completely fish out of water. I'm like, yeah, these bikes are really cool, but like, I don't kind of get it. Or like some of them, I'm like, I don't know motorcycles in general. So I'm sure like there's a couple really collectible bikes that were there of like, oh my God, they have one of these. But the Pikes Peak bike was super sick. It was a Harley Davidson, heavily modified, obviously to handle the altitude. But when it raced, I think it was in the late 70s is when it raced. It was back when obviously Pikes Peak was still fully dirt. So it had like the dirt tires on it, and like the dirt setup, which is kind of funny of like, yeah, the flat track guys, they race on dirt. So like building a Pikes Peak bike isn't necessarily like out of their realm of like sliding a bike on dirt.
Sure enough.
And the coolest thing was that era was still when they raced handlebar to handlebar. So
That's unreal.
Which like modern day Pikes Peak, of course, cars were always time trial one at a time.
Yeah.
And in the later years of when motorcycles raced up the mountain, they would send them one at a time. But there was an era that they would throw one green flag and one checkered flag for all of the motorcycles that wanted to race. And so you would be racing handlebar to handlebar against other people up Pikes Peak. And essentially the first person to get to the top was the winner.
That's just insanity. Could you imagine? I mean, some of those, I'm telling you, like, you need to know. But I mean, there's not guardrails in a lot of this stuff.
Oh,
People
yeah.
coming around these turns, trying to make an outside pass around somebody, and you go flying off the mountain. I mean, who in their right mind thought this was a good idea? Even at the time, it seems like this is just crazy.
Right. And I mean, like, that's the thing is, like, think about the added pressure of wanting to win Pikes Peak, and you can see your competitor in front of you to be like, I need to push harder
Right.
and go faster. Where, like, doing the time trials, it's not like you have, like, that split to be like, oh, I need to go a little bit quicker if I want to win this year's Pikes Peak. You don't kind of have that. You're mainly just racing yourself. You're racing the mountain. But to be on a motorcycle, which you have no protection, right? Like if you go off, you're just a body flying down the side of a mountain. It was insane. And like I had a lot of respect for that bike because it had made it to the top. I think it finished maybe third the year that it raced. So like it was a pretty like
Respectable.
success. Yeah, it was a successful bike. It was respectful in that sense. But I want to go back to those board track bikes because like those were another one of those ones where like I could understand the Pikes Peak bike, how it existed. But the board track stuff, that was another piece where it's like, I kind of understood the craziness. And I remember when we saw the board track bike and I think I asked like, you know, is this one of those ones that raced on like the board tracks back in the day to the guy that was showing us the collection? And he's like, yeah, actually this one is. And I think we have one other one. And he's like, how do you know about board tracks? I was like, oh, I looked into like the history of like circle track racing and, you know, sprint cars and stuff like that. And like remembered the era of the board tracks. And I asked Nick, I was like, dude, have you ever heard about board tracks? And he's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, dude, in the early 1900s, in like the 1910s and 1920s, they built these heavily banked oval tracks out of wood.
It's just crazy. And you have to go back to the history of these vehicles to get some context around it, right? So in like the late 1870s, bicycle racing was becoming a thing. And it was mostly like out in the world in the parks and stuff. They would go ride bikes and they'd race each other, and they decided they needed something safer. They needed something that would enable spectators to kind of participate and be there. And so they started building these things they called velodromes, which were oval tracks made for bicycles. And of course, over time, when they were going to build those things up, you know, technology was pretty limited. So wood seemed like a fine material to use for that. And, you know, bicycles aren't putting that much load into the thing. So why not build it out of wood? So the early velodromes that were hosting bicycle racing, well, people saw those bicycles and were like, hey, is there some way we can manage the traffic in the bicycle race? And you think about what safety cars or pace cars are like today. So they actually had like the lead bike that was like the pace car bike at that time. And they needed to make sure it was faster than all of the competitors following it. So what's a way to get more power into a bike? Have multiple riders. So these were like tandem and 3 and 4 and 5 person bicycles that they would use to lead the pack of other bikes around the velodrome.
Yeah, so like that was the creation of motorcycle racing, which was like looking back into this history and learning about this, I was like, this is insane. Like it legitimately started as cycling races, and velodromes, like those exist still today. Like if you watch the Olympics, you know exactly what we're talking about, like these heavily banked wooden tracks for bicycles. And if you ever watch the Olympics, you can see that like when they race one another, there is the main rider.
Right.
That is the one that's supposed to go on and win.
Yes.
And the other riders will basically just be a lead draft and
Right.
help to reduce the wind resistance. And so there would be these lead riders. And back in the day, back in the early 1900s, it was the same concept. They wanted to do these races for longer for bicycles. And to be able to cover these longer distances, they're like, hey, if we have someone lead the main rider, they'll have more energy to go longer kind of deal. And that's where those lead bikes came from, was like basically being a lead draft. And
That's
then
cool.
they realized, well, shoot, like if we need to be in front of this person for a long period of time and be able to conserve energy, let's just add more people. And that's when
Right.
that was the creation of the tandem bicycle, was from this, from the motorsports, not motorsports, but from the competition of cycling racing. That created the tandem bicycle. And then they created like 3 people bikes, 5 people bikes to keep like adding to this. And then the creation of like, let's just reduce the amount of people and let's add motors. The first couple of these motorized lead bikes for cycling racing was, one of them was electric and then the other one was steam powered. And then as this thing progressed, then they got into the internal combustion for these lead bikes for cycling racing. And then they're like, I mean, now we're like competing of who can create the better lead bike with the better power for cycling competition. Why don't we just race our lead bikes against one another? And then that created its own separate competition. And that was the beginning. That was the foundation of motorcycle racing, which is just like so crazy. Like it was this component of cycling racing that then became its own source of competition.
I love this origin story kind of history telling of these things, because you learn so much and you gain so much insight. You're like, people have been trying to race each other for a really long time. And
Yes.
that hasn't changed, but the mechanism, the venues, those are the things have changed. And so we went from bicycles to the point where in 1896, track cycling on bicycles was an Olympic sport. So that was its kind of heyday. Then we have primitive motorcycles starting to come up, and then we started seeing some motorcycle racing, and they said, oh, well, we built these velodromes, these board tracks for bicycles. Let's just put the motorized bikes on those. That makes total sense. And now we have these four-wheeled equivalents. Let's race those on the same things as well. And here we are, board track racing with cars, 1910s, 1920s.
It's so cool to see like this internal, like, I guess, drive in human beings to be competitive.
Yeah.
And it's like we think about motorsports nowadays and like how big of an industry it is, and racing cars, prototypes, open wheel, like all this sorts of stuff. But like you go back into the late 1800s, early 1900s, it's like, well, they didn't have the sophisticated tools that we have now to be able to go do this and race at like such high speeds, but they found anything they could to be like, let's be competitive and let's go fast. And in this transition that happened of like getting into motorcycles and then cars, I mean, there was just such a hunger of wanting to go faster. Like it was just like this thing of like, okay, we have this cool competition, but now let's like turn it up a notch and let's go faster. And when they moved on to motorcycle racing, they changed the terminology of what the tracks were called from a velodrome to a motordrome.
Motordrome. Yeah, it makes total sense. And just to put some perspective on this, like we think about today in modern technology, like, wow, things changed so quickly. It didn't seem like it used to be that way. Well, it was 1908. The first motordrome track was built. This was constructed out of wood. It was in Paterson, New Jersey. And the sanctioning body at the time was called the Federation of American Motorcyclists. They helped bring the first championship race to this motordrome in 1908. The next expansion happened in 1909. We had the first dedicated motorcycle board track was built. It was a 3rd-mile oval that opened up at the LA Coliseum Motordrome. And then in 1910, this thing went totally explosion, went mainstream. They opened yet another massive 1-mile circular Los Angeles Motordrome at Playa del Rey. And it turns out California was at the epicenter of this movement of board track racing. Before road courses started getting paved and all those things happened later, California was one of the main places this activity was happening. And there were tracks in LA, Beverly Hills, Culver City, Oakland, San Carlos, Cotati, in our own backyard here in Santa Rosa, and more. Board tracks that existed and they were being used for racing. It's really, really hard to get your head around.
For anyone that's listening, like if you haven't looked up board tracks or this is like a foreign concept to you, Google images. It will blow your mind what they were capable of doing back then and like how massive these tracks were and the bankings that were involved. And to kind of talk about that Los Angeles Motordrome that they created, like, and I know that there was ones that predated it, but like a lot of people consider that one to be like the first massive one. And that was the first one that also was dedicated to be built for motorcycles as well as cars.
Correct.
And it was a 1 mile circle, not an oval, right?
Correct.
We think about like circle track racing nowadays of like, it's really an oval, right? There's 2 straightaways and then the 2 hairpin corners on each end. But the one that was in LA, it was a complete circle. Like there was just, it just went around and around and around. And for spectators, it was great because like the spectators would basically sit on the top of the oval, right? So like you had this amazing view looking down. And another like track to kind of talk about of just like the sheer engineering that went into these facilities. There was another one that was in St. Louis, which was the St. Louis Motordrome. And it is attributed to be the steepest banked motordrome that they ever created. Once again, this track was a full circle, so there was never any straightaways, but it had banking of 62.5 degrees.
Whoa, that's like near vertical, right? The steepest banking in a road course I could think of is probably one of your super speedways, right? Like a Talladega or a Daytona.
Right, that's when we normally, like a super speedway, like heavily banked track nowadays, people usually think about Daytona, right? The Daytona Super Speedway.
Yeah.
Daytona has banking in its corners of just 31 degrees.
And
So
that's
half.
And that's massive. The people I've talked to who've driven Daytona, they're like, when you're driving straight, you're actually looking up out the windshield just because
Yes.
you're on this bank. And so this was twice as much banking.
62.5 degrees.
Holy crap.
Which, now, if we talk about what this racing actually looked like, right? And let's talk in regards to the motorcycles, then we'll get into the cars. Because most of these tracks were built for the motorcycles, and then the car guys were like, hey, they're doing this thing on this cool track, and we've just been racing on dirt ovals at basically horse tracks and fairgrounds. This looks cool, we can go faster.
Right.
But for the motorcycle races, especially with these circles, the bikes that they were racing in that period of time had no gears and no brakes.
No brakes.
So effectively, you would fire the thing up, it would just start puttering along, you would just add throttle, which would then accelerate, and you just get this thing wound up, and you're just going around in a circle, effectively on almost a vertical surface, going as fast as you possibly can.
That's just nuts. And then when you stop, you just kill the engine?
There was just a kill switch. That was it. So you had a starter, a throttle, and a kill switch. No
Wow.
brakes.
And I can imagine coming down off the banking is non-trivial, right? So it's not just like you'll coast to a stop.
No, yeah. I mean, like, it's pretty insane to think about this. And it's like, yeah, they just got wound up. And effectively, as the rider, like, you're just holding on. Like, you're just trying to go as fast as you possibly can, which is, once again, crazy to think about the mindset of this, of, like, the people that got involved in this racing were just, like, effectively daredevils, right? Like, they just had a death wish because they just wanted to go as fast as possible. When things would go wrong, they would go wrong hugely, right? Like, the spectators are basically looking down at the track. So if anything goes wrong and a bike leaves the track, like goes to the quote unquote outside of the corner or the top of the corner, they'll basically just bust through a wood barrier and straight into where the fans are. Like, it's just a crazy mindset. And a lot of people attribute to like why there was so many people that wanted to go do this racing in that time period was like, it was a time of peace. Like, there was nothing crazy going on in the world.
Right.
They had just got done with the Civil War.
Yeah.
It was going to be a long time until we got into World War I. There was no longer like the Wild Wild West and the cowboys. You know,
Yeah.
everything was pretty settled and civil.
Industrial Revolution took place, so things were starting to grow and build,
Yes.
and cities were getting bigger.
And so effectively, they're like, yeah, we just had these like groups of people, predominantly men, being like, I'm just itching to do something to risk my life, and I don't know how to like effectively express this emotion. And they're like, let's go race motorcycles and go as fast as we can on these board tracks made out of wood in circles.
There's something I feel like bears explanation here when we talk about a wood board track. Like, you probably imagine 2x4s or some kind of like flat boards that are set along side by side, and they make some banking and they make this big structure out of it. But no, the boards were actually turned on the short side. So they were kind of stacked side by side. And think about wood boards being planked down on a boardwalk or something like that. It's not like a smooth surface. It's not like a basketball court.
No, it's not polished. It's not
It's
like they
rutted.
put
Like
lacquer on it.
there's gaps in between the boards, and they're kind of like rounded off a little on the corners and so forth. So there's that. And then additionally, as you're using these wooden board tracks, you're kicking up splinters and chunks of wood out of the track. It's actually decomposing as we drive on it. Wait, it gets better. Okay, so these early motorcycles that are going on these highly banked tracks, they generally used smaller tracks for the motorcycles. So they built some motordromes that were a quarter mile or a third of a mile track.
So super short.
Super short. And to keep the riders from flying off the sides due to the centrifugal force of these tracks, they built banks up to 60 degrees like you were talking about, which meant these like vertical walls. And at the top, there was this little flimsy wooden guardrail, but to your point, things would fly up over that all the time. The bikes had no brakes, so they'd spin around and spin around and spin around, and then when they had to slow down, they had to cut the ignition, right? How about this part? This kind of blew me away. They call these engines total loss oil engines. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? They put oil straight into the engine, and it works its way through and spits out the exhaust onto the track behind them. So all the wooden planks gradually get slick with motor oil, and it starts to absorb into those boards, which combined with the rusty nails and giant wood splinters sticking out meant this wasn't exactly the most friendly surface to be on.
Right. I mean, like, I would imagine that the oil slick that would get put down, it's like, it would make the surface slipperier, causing more accidents. And that's the other thing is, like, you think about, like, all right, even if you have to lay down the bike, and assuming you don't exit the facility into the stands, into the crowd, sliding on wood, which, once again, this is not like a polished wood surface. It doesn't have, like, lacquer or whatever, like, the top coating to make it smooth. Like, you're going to be scraping along, like, rough wood that splinters and could easily kill you. And, I mean, this was a dangerous sport. Like, they even knew it in the time. They're like, this is getting out of hand.
And tire technology, I mean, they didn't have anything like what we have today. It was a completely different world.
Oh my God, the tires they used and the bike that was in the museum, that was one thing that I noticed. It had white tires. So this was pre-vulcanized rubber.
Oh my gosh.
So it was Michelin's that were the tires that were being used. And this is also, fun fact to anyone out there, I know you know this fun fact, but that's why the Michelin Man is white. And everyone thinks, like, because the Michelin Man is just a stack of tires. Well, it's like tires used to be white before they figured out the vulcanization process that turns them black.
Yeah, if you ever see a rubber plant, the stuff in them is that, like, whitish color.
Right. And so, yes, during this time period, the tire technology was still pre-vulcanized rubber. So, like, they were white-tired motorcycles.
That's really interesting. And so imagine these white tires riding through the oil-slicked wood. I mean, they probably didn't stay white very long. This ended very badly, right? Like, we've heard about these disasters that happen and, like, there's a sudden sea change in an area. Well, guess what? 1912 and 1913, motorcycle board track racing had sort of their equivalents of that, where we had multiple incidents where we had like 8, 10 plus people dead. Spectators, where exactly what we were describing, what happened was the bikes flew up out of the motordrome into the crowd, which earned them the nickname in the press, murderdromes. So it didn't last very long after this. Once you start calling these things the murderdromes, they weren't that popular, even though people were looking for, daredevil kind of activity. And around this time, the cars were getting more popular, right? People were seeing road cars start to emerge. And the racing in a road car was a little less sketchy than the motorcycles, but brought a whole new dynamic given the weight and the dynamics of the vehicle.
What was funny is, like, so the story that you're telling about the murderdromes is, I'm pretty sure that only canceled, like, the small tracks like we were talking about, the half mile, quarter mile, third mile.
Yeah, they kept all the big tracks.
Right. They were like, yeah, those ones are too dangerous with the, like, severe banking of 60 degrees. So we'll get rid of all those, but, like, we'll keep the bigger tracks that we've been designing for the cars.
And that have been being run for a couple of years, so they're just kind of absorbing more and more oil, like the more races that happen on them, right?
And so, like, the tracks that got developed for the cars on these board tracks, those started to look more like oval racing circuits that we know nowadays, which is the two banked corners connected with two long straightaways. But the banking that was still there was still substantial. Like, there was a couple board tracks of this, like, over a mile. Some were even 2 miles long, which is a huge oval. Like, if you think about
Yeah.
how much wood was used to create these things, it's just insane. Like, I still can't, like, it blows my mind the engineering that went
And
into
wood
it.
laying on its side, like the less
Right.
efficient way to do it.
But like those ovals, the 2-mile ovals that were really, really quick, they still had 40 degrees of banking.
Just
Once again,
crazy.
still 10 degrees above what Daytona has of how much they were banked. And these were the ones that we had cars racing on, motorcycles, all that sort of stuff. And even the old footage that you look at back on of like these races that were happening on these board tracks, there's just like dust and stuff coming up from behind the vehicles of like you're talking about, just the wood being vaporized as these vehicles were going over it. And it's just crazy, the people that were like willing to get on board of like, whether it was on motorcycles, which motorcycles in general are dangerous because if you crash, you get launched. But even the cars that they were racing back then were super primitive, like no seatbelts. You still had the mechanic riding passenger with you to make adjustments to the engine to make sure that it was running well, like all that sorts of stuff. And even the gentleman that was there giving us the tour of the Flat Track Museum, he was telling stories of back then for board tracks, if the track was like decomposing or breaking down during the middle of the race, there was individuals that were like the track maintenance crew that there was their job to sit underneath the scaffolding in the corners and have extra pieces of wood. So if a piece of wood started like breaking down, they would pull it out and put a new piece of wood in while the race was going on. So you're kind of like checking around to be like, all right, there's a gap in the action, slide another piece of wood in to keep the track in good condition.
Just the construction of these places. Yeah, you mentioned that. We failed to describe. They needed to have this entire network of scaffolding around the base of these things, supporting all
Yeah.
the wood that was up there in this banked wood ovals that they were building, or circles in some cases. One of those really large wooden bowls that they built was in Altoona, Pennsylvania, the Altoona Speedway they called the Wooden Bowl. It was built in the 20s, I think. It was a 1.25 mile oval. And just to keep this in mind, right, safety. We're talking leather helmets and goggles. There was no protection from anything, no seatbelts, no fire protection. They didn't have anything like that. There was no fireproof anything. They'd get splinters and debris kicking up off the road. There'd be oil all over the place. You know, a lot of people died doing this stuff. And it's
Yeah.
another reason that this activity faded away. Also because these wooden tracks required so much upkeep. The operators, the track owners of these tracks had to spend so much money constantly tending to them, replacing boards and stuff. And, you know, they're fragile. They're made out of wood.
Yeah, and the main reason why, because you might be thinking like, why did they make wood tracks? Like, why wouldn't you just make dirt tracks? And obviously there was the piece of they wanted to go faster, they wanted to go quicker, and it actually was easier to make high banked wood tracks than it was dirt tracks.
Yeah.
And wood at this time was incredibly inexpensive. So like it wasn't a problem. The lumber industry was booming. There was plenty of forests. Like this was a cheap material in that time. Now, obviously as things change and the years went on, it became more and more expensive to get the wood to then replace, rebuild, maintain these tracks. And of course, like if a wildfire or a fire broke out in a local area, you'd lose your racetrack. The racetrack would catch on fire.
So speaking of which, at the end of 1921, the Bay Area had another one of these tracks built in San Carlos. And it's where the San Carlos Airport is today, if you know the area of the peninsula of the San Francisco Bay Area. Well, they built this track in December of 1921. That's when they opened it anyway. The first race they had, it was a car race. The purse for this race was $25,000 in 1921. So that's like $500,000 or $600,000 to the winner of this race. Not inconsequential. The grandstands, this race was set up for 40,000 spectators, okay, at the end of 1921. By June of 1922, there was a fire that burned the thing to the ground, and that was it. So they didn't even get a full 7 months of racing in at this place before it burned to the ground.
Yeah, it's kind of funny of like, yeah, your racetrack could burn to the ground. I'm sure that like oil-soaked wood goes up pretty good too.
Yeah, and if you ever hear about the Greater San Francisco Speedway, this is what that was, and it didn't last for very long. Oil-soaked boards, nearby grass fire, you're done.
So it's crazy, like these tracks that we're talking about, you might think of like, oh, they might have built like a handful of them or like they weren't super prominent. In a list, I'm sure there was more, but for sure confirmed, there was 24 major board tracks across the country.
Yes.
Like that's substantial. Like this was a huge thing. And the spectatorship was massive. I mean, during this time period, people were hungry for entertainment. And motorsports and these races were a huge source of this entertainment. Like
Oh, yeah.
going watching these daredevils. I mean, it's essentially the 1900s version of like watching the gladiators or the chariot races back in the old days. Like it's the same thing, right? We just love watching people risk their lives. There's something about it in humanity. But another couple of these tracks that I want to mention, one of them is the Tacoma Speedway, which was up in Tacoma, Washington. This was one of those tracks that was a 2-mile circuit.
So huge, just
Yeah, I think there was maybe like 5 2-mile circuits across the country. Like there was a handful of these really, really long tracks that were super fast. And the funny thing is in this time period of when the Tacoma Speedway existed, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway was also created in the 1910s. So like we can't discredit that. And we know, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway is famously nicknamed the Brickyard.
Right.
They made that track out of bricks. So like this is a time period when like it wasn't cement and asphalt. Like that wasn't a thing readily available
that
yet.
technology was still developing.
Which is crazy. So like they made that one out of bricks. We had these board tracks created. But there was a handful of years that the Tacoma Speedway had qualifying speeds greater than the Indianapolis Motor Speedway.
Out of control.
And we think about Indy as this massive track of these high speeds. And here's one of these board tracks that was created that had higher speeds than Indy for a handful of times. And if you actually look at a track map of the Tacoma Speedway, it does have this like unique 4-cornered oval look that Indy is known for, where it's like a straightaway to a turn to a straightaway to a turn, straightaway turn, straightaway turn. But the Tacoma Speedway, it's not symmetrical. Like it almost looks like a weird mix between Indy and Pocono, which Pocono is known as the tricky triangle because it only has 3 corners.
Right.
But each corner on the Tacoma Speedway is different out of the 4 corners, which very, very unique. But like, it just goes to show you that like this was a massive part of motorsports. And for me, like looking back on this history and looking at like the old footage and photos and like how crazy this was, I was like, how have I never heard of this before? Like, why don't people talk about this?
Yeah.
And it is a really unfortunate thing because like the history of board tracks literally disappeared. Whether the track stayed and it literally decomposed and it returned to the earth. A lot of these tracks, if they weren't successful, especially like the one in Katati, was legitimately disassembled so they could use the lumber for other projects. So it's
Oh
like,
my gosh.
these tracks, like there is just nothing left of them. And like, it's not like, like nowadays, these old oval tracks where it's like you can see, the old ruins, they're just completely gone.
It's a sad thing for this to have disappeared. But again, if we look back at the history and we understand when in time we're talking about, this building, this upsurgence of this new activity was taking place in the early 1900s, right? A lot of new technology was coming about. The world was changing in a massive way at a rate that was much greater than it had ever done before. And by the end of the 1920s, the Great Depression hits. And all the money that was invested into these fun activities and recreation and building this stuff up went away. And so in 1931, the Altoona, the big wooden bowl track, that one closed. And most of the other ones that hadn't burned down by that time had fallen into disrepair and they couldn't afford to keep them up anymore. So they all got torn down or burned down.
Yeah, which is crazy. I mean, like, I don't know why. There's just something inside me that's like, I want to see one of these tracks in person. Because, like, from the photos, the sheer scale, like, once again, a 2-mile oval track is massive. And the whole thing is made out of wood. And, like you're saying, like, the engineering that went into like the scaffolding and stuff. And like, I would say a way to describe this, like the way that the banked corners were held up was like the same sort of like scaffolding style that like wooden roller coasters are held up by.
Yeah.
Same sort of vibe, right? A lot of wood, right? But just from the photos, like how big these things were and like what they were able to create and how high the banked corners were too is just like there's something inside me that I'm like, I need to see one in person. And like, it's so unfortunate that there isn't one that still exists of like, oh, you can go see this one that's still out there and whatever. And like, we're never going to rebuild these. Like this is just something that's like, it makes no sense to make a wooden track again, but is something that was so cool and such a cool part of motorsport history. And learning how it originated from bikes and motorcycles was such a cool thing too. Cause once again, like because I don't have that kind of love for motorcycle racing or bicycles or whatever it was, it's cool to see like something that started from their realm progress and turn into what would become, in my opinion, what would become these high banked paved tracks in the future.
Yeah, and mostly in motorsports, we talk about this evolution where we're moving forward into the future and there isn't an end point. And so it's kind of sad and different when we hear about something that existed for a while and then ended and just hasn't come back.
Yeah.
And there's no practical way that it's going to, And so the Great Depression sort of ended a lot of this. And then a few board tracks continued on after that, but they were mostly smaller venues. One of the last ones that was around was in New York. It was the Coney Island Velodrome. And they did midget races there up until about 1939. And then there was a track in the Bronx that also ran midgets into the early 1940s. Again, history being what it is, with the coming of World War II, all of those efforts, all those resources were diverted to, the war efforts. So that was the end of board tracks. And literally, there are no more anymore. They're all gone.
Yeah.
There are the foundations where they were built. There may be some historical markers and so forth, but this is something that no longer exists. You can't go see one of these anymore. So we have to grab all of the literature that we have, whatever photos or primitive early film that there might exist, to go out and try to piece this together and understand this history of something that's almost completely gone. And we're grasping at straws even to find out what we can find out about it.
Yeah, it is unfortunate that board tracks don't exist, but what still do exist are flat tracks. So getting back to the beginning of the story, if this is something that's interesting to you and with the board track racing and stuff like that, and its origins coming from the motorcycle side, flat track is still a very kind of old school form of motorcycle racing. And it's still alive and well. I mean, races are kind of fewer and far between, but if it's something that's interesting to you, like definitely go look it out, right? Find a flat track near you, watch these guys slide these motorcycles, almost laying them completely flat through the corner, drifting the bikes. Like, it is such a beautiful form of motorsport because it takes so much talent and control to control the bikes. And if for whatever reason you're road tripping down the 99 and you're going through North Fresno, make sure to stop at that Clovis Flat Track Museum because you'll be able to see a board track bike, which is a really, really unique thing to see. And there's not very many of those left, as well as learning a huge history about flat track racing in general. I mean, I can't give credit enough to that museum of like what a hidden gem it was. And once again, I don't think there's going to be any time that I go through Fresno again, but I will for sure remember the memories of going through the Clovis Flat Track Museum and what a cool experience that was, and learning something different about motorsports.
It's super cool, and there's a whole other world here. If you look at, there's a group called American Flat Track, and they're the main sanctioning body for flat track racing that happens today. And we talk about it like it's a monolith, like there's one thing. No, they have short track, they have half mile and mile ovals, they have TT courses, they have different kinds of bikes. There's more of a dirt bike style than there is more of a road course. So there's a whole world there, too, to explore and understand, and that's one of the things that makes this whole motorsports thing so fascinating and amazing. There's always more to learn. Just when you think you know it, there's something else.
Yeah, and that's what's so cool about it, too, is just like the drive of passion and the passion of the people. And in this community, it's super rad to meet those other people. And whether it's your taste or your cup of tea or not, it's just so cool to hear the stories. And I mean, I've never been interested in going to a flat track race, but like there's something about it now where I'm like, maybe I need to check that out. Like those guys are some serious racers and risking their lives still to be on those bikes and sliding them, especially at those larger tracks that they go to. Like the speeds are pretty substantial. So
yeah, so I think we're going to have that future episode where we do our debrief after we went to our first flat track race.
And what the vibes were like.
Totally, man. Well, that was really fun. Thanks for the conversation, Sylas.
Yeah, thanks for listening to my story and diving deeper into board tracks. I mean, I feel like every time we look into them, I just learn something new and I'm re-excited about them.
It's so good. That's why we do this stuff, man.
Well, thanks for listening. This has been Cold Start.